Wow. Good evening, everybody. Welcome. I'm Jennifer LaRue. I'm the Director of Public Programs at the Mark Twain House and Museum in Hartford, Connecticut. And so happy to see so many of you here tonight, although I am slightly concerned that so many of you are interested in murder by poison and so forth, but it is what it is. I'm just glad to have you here. I can't wait to hear this evening's talk. I've spent a little bit of time with Dean and Deborah in Tech Run and in the green room just now, and I can guarantee you're in for a fascinating evening. So I'm not going to stay on the screen for too very long. I just want to do a little bit of housekeeping. First of all, thank you for discovering the chat and letting us know who you are and where you're from. It's great to see people from all over here. That's the beauty of these virtual programs. And so please continue chatting away as the program continues. However, toward the end of our program, we are going to have audience Q&A. And if you have a question for Dean or Deborah, or both of them, rather than put it in the chat where it's kind of hard for us to find, if you could kindly put that down at the bottom of the screen, there's a section called Ask a Question. And if you could put it there, it'll make it a lot easier for me to handle that when I come back on to help. And also, you can look at other people's questions, and if you have the same one, you can vote for it, and it kind of moves to the top of the heap if you do that. So please take advantage of that opportunity. Also in the chat, and I'll repost it because it's moved way high, but you'll find a link through which you can purchase a copy of Dean Jobb's book that we're going to be talking about tonight, The Case of the Murderous Dr. Cream. This book just came out, so we're really excited for Dean to be really early on his book tour. And we know that you can purchase this elsewhere. But do know that if you buy it through us, you get a signed copy, which is not the case everywhere. And also know that your purchase benefits the Mark Twain House and Museum, and we very much appreciate that support. Speaking of that support, right beneath my face is a long green button that says, "Your support is vital to the Mark Twain House and Museum. Please donate here." That is truer than you know. We have weathered the pandemic so far in pretty good shape. I have to say I'm very proud of the museum staff and board of trustees for the hard work everybody has put in to keeping us active and engaged and getting us over the hump. But it hasn't been easy, and we've been without, until just a month or so ago, we've been without our major source of revenue, which is our guided house tour. And as an aside, if you have not come to Hartford and taken a tour of Mark Twain's house, you got to put that on your bucket list because it's just an amazing experience. We are open now giving those tours. I was over at the house today and tons of people were taking the tour. It was fantastic to see, but we are playing a little bit of catch-up ball. So that's all by way of saying that if you are able to spare anything, large or small, with us by clicking on that button, I just want you to know that on behalf of the staff and the trustees of the museum, every single penny is appreciated and put to very, very good use. So having said all of that, I'd like to introduce our sponsors introduce our guests after thanking our sponsors. Today's program is sponsored by the Wish You Well Foundation and by Connecticut Public WNPR, and it's produced in part with support honoring the legacy of Frank Lord. So our guests tonight, we're so lucky to have them with us. Deborah Bloom, director of the Knight Science Journalism Program at MIT and the publisher of Undark Magazine, is a Pulitzer Prize-winning science journalist, columnist, and author of 6 books. Most recently, I don't think this is most recently, she wrote The Poisoner's Handbook, and then most recently, The Poison Squad, which was a 2018 New York Times notable book. That book, as with all her most recent books, focuses on influential moments in the history of science. Dean Jobb is an award-winning author and journalist and a professor at the University of King's College in Halifax, Nova Scotia, where he teaches in the Master of Fine Arts and Creative Nonfiction program. Lucky students. He specializes in true crime, and his monthly column on the genre, Stranger Than Fiction, appears in Ellery Queen's Mystery Magazine. So I'm going to bring them up on screen, and I hope you'll help me join them, help me welcome them. It takes a moment to get them all mic'd up and everything, so bear with us, please. There's Dean, and there's Deborah. Welcome, Dean and Deborah. Thank you so much for being here this evening with us.
Thank you.
Thank you. It's great to be here.
I'm going to back away now and just let me know when it's time to help with the questions. And I'm going to sit back and relax like everybody else. So have fun.
Thank you. It's great. So, Dean, I'm going to jump right in. As you know, I'm a longtime fan of your work and also a longtime fan of poison as a homicidal method. And I was so excited to see your book come out. I think Neil Cream is one of the sort of unknown, fascinating figures in homicidal history. Tell me why Neil Cream now? Why did you focus on him now? Why take this character who was really famous in the late 19th century and bring him back to us now?
Well, that's the reason he's forgotten, as you said, and unknown, which is surprising. I mean, given as many as 10 victims, this killing spree over 3 countries in the late 1800s. And it's not that he deserves to be remembered, but how he got away with it deserves to be remembered and studied. And that was really my focus. I wanted to understand how this figure that you encounter when you're doing research in that period, if you have an eye for true crime, as I do, I guess, it's hard to miss him. His case was a sensation, as you mentioned, headlines around the world, and just the sheer brutality and depravity of his crimes. So I really wanted to understand how this doctor could get away with murder, literally time and time again. And that led me into this exploration of the context that he operated in.
Did he surprise you once you took a closer look at him?
Well, again, what really surprised me, I suppose the most, was how close the authorities were at various points to stopping him. He had killed 2 people in Canada. His second victim was a female patient. He was the prime suspect, testified at the inquiry. No one believed he was innocent. The jury left an open verdict at the coroner's inquest. Cream skipped down. So I looked in vain for any kind of record that would suggest, why didn't they prosecute? So he escapes there and escapes to kill again. Gets to Chicago in 1880. A patient dies in a botched operation, and he actually stands trial for murder. Again, third victim, isn't this the chance to stop him? He has a really good lawyer, and the jury acquits him. So it goes on and on like that. So at every time when it looks like the gig is up for him, he manages to find an escape hatch.
The late 19th century was an interesting period of dramatic crimes and serial killers. I think at the time they tended to talk about them more as stranger killers, right? Serial killer is a more recent term, and I kind of love the term stranger killer because it really speaks to the fact that you're not killing family members or close acquaintances. But there were some notable serial killers of the time with poison. I'm thinking of Marianne Cotton, the arsenic murderess, say, of the similar period. Or, of course, and you reference him, Jack the Ripper. Or if you come over to the United States, you have people like Belle Gunness, who was a female serial killer here, based in Indiana, actually. What is it that makes Neil Cream, and you mentioned him as being, I think the term you used is brutal, out of this background? And I want to come back to the problems of the policing of the time, the ability to people. I mean, Marianne Cotton killed well over a dozen people. What is it that makes Neil Cream to you stand out? Is it the brutality? Is it the underlying insanity? Is it the skillfulness of his elusive behavior? What to him makes him stand out from this background of trouble?
Well, I think it's the professional standing and the betrayal of trust. He's a doctor, and by training, should have been a skilled one. I mean, he ended up getting a license from the College of Physicians and Surgeons in Edinburgh, which was the top licensing agency for medical practitioners at the time. So he obviously had skills, and the way that he preyed on women, vulnerable women, desperate women, women who came to him because he was known, wherever he went, he was known as an abortionist. And he would perform illegal abortions at a time when women could not have a child out of wedlock. One commentator I quoted said it was a living death. And so this is a really different aspect to his crimes, this betrayal of trust. And unlike many killers, he didn't have to stalk his victims. They were forced to come to him. And the brutality really comes from the method he used and the kind of poison, but also I think from that betrayal and really trading on his trust, which, as I said, brought his victims to him, but also helped him evade suspicion because his status as a medical man. Well, I mentioned him being acquitted of one murder. Well, that was his big defense was, no, look how skilled a surgeon I am. I mean, he actually testified at his trial to he had his credentials with him on the witness stand. I could not have done this botched operation that killed this woman, and the jury believed him.
That point of betrayal, I think, is so chilling and important. Let's talk then about the poison a little bit. And I don't want to focus on my work particularly, but I do want to say that when I wrote Poisoner's Handbook, which is about poison, how do you catch a poisoner? I developed a deep affection for arsenic, which is a wonderful, at least especially then, was a wonderful homicidal poison because it was odorless and tasteless and mimicked the symptoms of natural illness. That's totally not true of strychnine. I mean, strychnine is a poison that shouts itself out in many ways. It's an awful death. There's nothing subtle about it the way you have with what I think of as some of the clever homicidal poisons. So I want to approach this in two levels. One, why do you think Neil Cream chose strychnine? And two, and I know we talked about this a little bit earlier, because he was a doctor, I think he knew steps to kind of make it a little less obvious than it would have been if I picked up a bottle of strychnine on the street at the time, say. And could you talk a little bit about the sort of devious way he attempted to use that poison?
Well, you mentioned arsenic. One of the reasons that Neil Cream wouldn't choose arsenic was by mid-century there was a reliable lab test for a mineral poison like that. So strychnine was one of the newer discovered. I'm basing this on my knowledge of your book. Actually, you explained this so well that almost an arms race between toxicologists trying to find ways to detect poison and poisoners trying to find new poisons. By the time Neil Cream was using strychnine, no, there was nothing novel about it. There was a color test that was used. If it, in certain chemical reactions, if it changed to a violet hue, that suggested strychnine. The science had not advanced that much. I talk about Thomas Stevenson, the leading toxicologist in Britain in the 1890s, who testified at Cream's trial. One of his tests for the presence of strychnine was to take a fluid recovered from the body of a victim and touch it to his tongue, and he claimed that he could differentiate the burning sensation of 50 different poisons by taste alone. Now that's a real commitment to your science, I think, to do that.
Yes.
But you were saying, like, why did he pick strychnine? Well, first of all, as a doctor, he could access it because it was in trace amounts used in so many medicines at the time, in a similar way that arsenic was common in its day and would be found in certain compounds and uses. It was harder to get by Cream's time, but he just simply traded on his status as a doctor, which gave him access. But I really think that, and this is why I don't use the word brutality lightly. I think he chose it because of the agonizing death he knew it would cause. As you said, it's truly horrible. It's usually identified, although in a couple of cases, Cream benefited from the fact it also can mimic the symptoms and the seizures of tetanus.
Right.
So there was some confusion at times, and certainly his defense tried to say that some of these deaths might have been tetanus, misinterpreted. But he knew that it could be hours and hours of agonizing seizure after seizure, and his victims would be lucid through it all as they slowly died.
I find that so horrifying. I mean, one of the things that I realized when I was looking at poison and murder is that poison killings or poison homicides are really the only homicides that are always premeditated, right? You can lose your temper and kill someone in the United States, certainly with a gun, but a brick, a baseball bat, you know, all of these impulse killings. Poisoners are never impulsive. They have to do some pre-planning, and to pre-plan with a poison that was famously as horrific in its symptoms really speaks to someone who is incredibly cold at heart. You talk about the fact that he was also strategic in the choice of his victims, and that many of them were women without particular power. I'd like to dwell on that, but I'd like to also point out that this is often a characteristic. It certainly has been a characteristic of many serial killers, even in recent times. The Green River Killer in the Pacific Northwest, who preyed primarily on prostitutes. Henry Lee Lucas, the same, right? In which you see serial killers, or stranger killers, if you will, deliberately picking victims where they are calculating that no one will miss them, or that they don't matter, or that they have no power. And it struck me when I was reading your book that you also see, in addition to the poison calculation, let me pick something that's acutely painful. You also have the calculation of, let me do this to women who don't matter. Would you say that's right, wrong? I mean, what do you think his psychology is?
Cream was a misogynist, obviously, and had an intense hatred of women that only burned brighter through his career. He became more lethal. He had 9 of his victims were women. 1 was a man, but in that case, it was the husband of a woman he was having an affair with. So there may have been some sort of a different, though he used strychnine again in pill. But he was strategic in his choice of victims. They were tended to be young women, not necessarily who wouldn't be missed, but perhaps wouldn't be as likely to be on the police radar. Many of them were women who were new to the city. At least one of his victims was a Canadian. In Chicago was a woman from Canada, which maybe made her gravitate to a doctor from Canada. Who knows? But the other aspect to it, I think, is that I'm going to have to say, Deborah, there was kind of a second part to the question there, and I think I've lost it.
I mean, I was talking about the sort of strategy of picking victims without power.
Right. Sorry. Yes. Well, one of the intriguing things about Cream is I wanted this to be the definitive book. So I wanted to make sure, well, how many people did he kill? And what is there strong evidence for? And I came up with 10. There were indications of other victims, but they tended to be isolated press reports. saying that he killed in cities where he had never been. And it isn't just me coming along 120 years later. Scotland Yard sent a detective to North America to try to find his background after he was caught in London. And he went to some. It was funny. I was seeing him make go to the same goose chases in 2 other cities where the press were saying there might be victims. So what's intriguing about this is Cream did practice for a number of years and presumably saw a lot more patients. I mean, every indication is that he may not have had an overburdened practice, but that he did see other patients. At some point, he must have made this really sick calculation that this particular woman would die, whereas others, presumably, he didn't kill. So again, the depravity that would lead someone to do that. I quote one of his medical instructors in McGill University in Montreal, where he did his medical training, saying that a doctor has godlike powers to stand between the living and the dead. Well, of course, he meant godlike powers to save lives, but it's almost like Cream went the other way and said, I'll use this godlike power to literally play God.
And maybe he enjoyed that, right? That ability to,
Well, yeah, that's a good point too, Deborah, because remember, he's not sticking around to see what happens to his victims. He knows what's going to happen to them because he's a medically trained man. He knows exactly what a death by strychnine looks like. As an undergrad, as a medical student, he took something called medical jurisprudence, which is all about identifying ways that people have died in case you're called in on an autopsy or a coroner's inquiry, which commonly doctors would be. So he was learning to save lives. He was learning to see how people died and what from various causes. And so he perfected a way, and you talked about, you mentioned this too, he started tainting medicines. Looked like some of them might have been liquid medicines. Then he seemed to have found a way to poison pills. And then ultimately, when he gets to London for his final murders, London, England, he actually sources a new kind of pill, a gelatin capsule that you put medicine in, and it's designed to make medicine easier to take, just like the kind of capsules we take today. It had a bonus for Cream because strychnine is so bitter, it's hard to get someone to ingest enough strychnine to kill them, for sure. And this was the perfect vehicle. So again, so calculating and using his knowledge. And as I mentioned in the book, one of the pharmacies he went to, they should have never sold him strychnine in London because he wasn't qualified anymore to be a doctor, certainly not in London. But he was a doctor, so they bent the rules. They sold him strychnine and then helped him find capsules of the exact size he wanted. So it's just chilling to read that. And not asking. It would have been nice if they'd said, by the way, what are you going to do with these things? Nobody asked.
But they didn't ask. I don't want to give away, Dean, the things that led to his eventual capture, because I want to encourage people to read the book and find them out for themselves. But I do want to talk a little bit about policing in this particular time, because when I read your book, and your book is so evocative of the Victorian time, it's one of the things I really love about it. But when you read your book, you're talking about a period where police work is really still in its primitive stages. I mean, you reference the fact, and I went, oh, that's absolutely right, that if you look at toxicology, for instance, with arsenic, the Marsh test which is the test for arsenic, doesn't come in until the 1840s. And then there's this whole period where no one knows how to find a plant-based poison in the body, right? And strychnine, by the way, is a plant-based poison. It comes from a tree with the very evocative name of Nux vomica, which always makes me slightly queasy just when I say it.
Yeah, spoiler
Yeah,
alert there, I think, yeah.
um, but this is a primitive time, both in toxicology. How do we even detect a poison? But the professional police force is still taking place, and so I'm curious, or I would love for you to talk about that on two different levels, really, and I'll remember them. One is just the lack of a well-trained, well polished police investigative force, and two is the Victorian attitude toward women again, right? Where often the testimony of women was in fact discounted, right? Or even women who were poisoners were discounted because they were women. But I wonder if you could talk a little bit from your perspective about how both those factors, the early police force and the Victorian attitudes toward women as killers and as witnesses and as victims, played into this.
Well, I had some fascinating insights. I found a lot of Scotland Yard detectives wrote memoirs, and it was quite something to read. I mean, Scotland Yard at the time was probably the leading detection agency in the world, but inspectors at the end of their careers, inspectors who came up in the ranks 1880s and 1890s when they were investigating cream, talked about how there was no training. And of course, this is the era before. This is before fingerprints. There's a limited forensics. In a poison case, yes, they're going to call on a toxicologist, but to the extent that modern policing methods were unknown. One inspector talked about that his two best colleagues were Sergeant Luck and Inspector Chance. Right?
Oh, I love that.
These were who we relied on. One of the best detection methods, or touted in some of these memoirs, was, well, if a known criminal came to town, you just shadowed him or tailed him until you saw who he was meeting with, and then kept tailing them until they committed a crime. So it's an investment of time and effort, but preventing crime was difficult, and investigating was difficult. And another telling thing was that many of the old school detectives, when mugshots were coming into vogue, and they were by Cream's time, this would seem like a cutting edge way of photograph of a suspect or an inmate or a criminal, someone who might have perpetrated a crime. Many of the detectives refused to look at them and said they would rather rely on their memory. And they would say, well, someone could grow a mustache, grow a beard, change their appearance. So I mean, you saw that sort of old school attitude. But getting to the second part of your question about the role of women, when Cream gets to London in the early 1890s, it's only 3 or 4 years after Jack the Ripper. And you see echoes of Jack the Ripper in the Scotland Yard investigation as they slowly realize that the bodies piling up in this neighborhood called Lambeth point to a single person doing it. And as you said, serial killers were not as common. They were not the kind of scourge they are today. It was a new kind of monster, and you could see that detectives as well as the public struggled to get their mind around this kind of a breed of killer who just killed to kill. So you see that developing. You also see the echoes of, at one point, one of the policemen says, well, we're having the same problem we had in the Whitechapel murders, Jack the Ripper. The women were so unreliable. Now, these are women who weren't exactly getting much protection from the police. In fact, one woman had Cream visit her when he was very much a suspect. This was one sex worker in Lambeth when Cream was looking like their prime suspect, and they didn't intervene. And then later asked, well, what happened? And it turned out he'd mixed her a drink, but she prudently hadn't taken it. So, yeah, there was kind of echoes and evidence of kind of a disregard there, and a frustration that women weren't more helpful to the police. But again, without giving too much away, what I found ultimately is several of the women who are discounted at times by the detectives actually play a crucial role in bringing him to justice. And it was really interesting to see that. One woman in particular, and again, I won't give anything away, but is instrumental in tying Cream to the murders.
I liked, and I don't want to give anything away either, and we may be talking about the same person, the would-be victim who
Yeah.
he gave his pills to and who cleverly even did sleight of hand to keep him from knowing that. I mean, just so inspired. Let's talk, and we only have a little more time before I'm going to see if Jennifer can come back, and because I'm sure there's some wonderful questions from this audience, but talk a little bit about the influence of this period in policing, this period in killers like Neil Cream on detective fiction. You're an expert in detective fiction as well, and you reference in the book, for instance, Arthur Conan Doyle, who himself had trained in medicine, right, and the creation of Sherlock Holmes, and in general, in the Sherlock Holmes stories, the police do not shine either necessarily, right? So I wish,
Right.
do you feel that killers like Neil Cream, for instance, had an influence on the way detective stories are told about this period as well?
Well, it's fascinating, and one of the things I explored and explore in the book is that at the height of Cream's murders in London in the winter of 1891-92, the Strand magazine is publishing monthly Conan Doyle Sherlock Holmes adventures. And while Sherlock Holmes had been in a couple of novels by that point, this is what put the Holmes character through the stratosphere. This is what made Conan Doyle's name as a writer of detection fiction. And while Cream is committing his murders, in one of the stories, Sherlock Holmes says to Watson, a doctor who goes wrong is the first of criminals. He has the nerve and he has the knowledge, which is exactly what Cream did. And I was intrigued whether Conan Doyle, I even went through Conan Doyle's papers at the British Library as part of my research, which was wonderful for insights on its own, but in vain looking for any reference to Cream. But one intriguing connection is that Conan Doyle was in Edinburgh in 1878 when Cream was there. No idea whether they crossed paths, but interestingly, a doctor named Joseph Bell, who taught Conan Doyle, actually sat on the licensing board that granted Cream his license. And Bell was this he had a lightning fast ability to size people up. And that's the model for Sherlock Holmes's ability to size people up by the wear on their cuff, the mud on their boots. And it's quite intriguing that, again, another missed opportunity. It's too bad he hadn't picked up some vibes about Thomas Neil Cream.
Do you think, I mean, we're looking at a particular period in time in which you can say, well, you know, in Victorian times, this about the police, this about, you know, the methods at hand. But do you think there are lessons for us today in stories of people like Neil Cream, Dean?
Well, I mean, it's not as ham-fisted as "Don't Trust Your Doctor," which is silly, and it's well. I guess what I found intriguing was some of the struggle to piece together, to envision that one serial killer was involved here. It still is a problem today. And it's maybe the other way at times. I mean, now with the explosion of amateur sleuthing and the popularity of true crime, it's almost like we see serial killers everywhere. And that one fact, DNA and all the advances in forensics, yes, they can help. But police forces and investigators still struggle to tie one killer, if there is one killer, to what seem to be seemingly random, unrelated crimes. There's a commonality in many of the victims of crime, and his method is similar. But again, to piece that together was a challenge then, and it can still be a challenge now.
That's an interesting point that I think there's a part of us, because a serial killer is so inhuman in so many ways, and we have a hard time, I think, accepting that someone could methodically plot out death after death and crime after crime, because it tips over some line in which we want to believe that we're not capable of that. Right. And I think that's true for all of us and true for the police. There were elements in your story that reminded me of the backstory of the Golden State Killer in California, where you see the police discounting over years and years the testimony of women. Right.
Yeah.
Of course, in that case, the serial killer was a police officer or a former police officer. So there was probably that as well. But I do think there are commonalities that we should acknowledge, and that the story of Neil Cream resonates today in some really fascinating way. And we're just about at the time that I would like to ask Jennifer to come back. I see a lot of questions in the queue, and I want to make sure you have plenty of time to answer those. It's been fascinating for me to have.
Thank you. Thank you. Yeah.
Oh, wow. I've just been riveted and hanging on every word. Thank you so much. But our audience does have some amazing questions. So I'm going to jump right in, because there are actually quite a few of them, and some of them probably will take a few minutes. So a number of people would like to hear an answer to Arnold's question. Dean, could you talk a little about his upbringing and his family relationships?
This was fascinating, and again, I really wanted to tell a definitive story, so I went deeper into his background than anything I'd ever seen written about Cream. And he grew up in Quebec City. His father was a wealthy timber merchant in the city, born in Scotland, but came to Canada as a child. Privileged upbringing, and very strong Presbyterian background. Taught Sunday school, sang in the church choir. His father was a leading figure in the church and in the community. There was plenty of money to send him to McGill Medical School in Montreal, and plenty of money for him to dress very flamboyantly, and he was known to display his jewelry, really flaunting his wealth. He wasn't very well liked by his classmates. And so by the time he graduates in 1876 and then is about to embark on his murder spree, you get that very clear picture of a pampered, narcissistic, self-centered person, and who's now armed with what should have been the skills to do good in the world. And uses that to kill. There was one great letter I encountered that was written later by a former employer in Quebec City, because he worked briefly in the office of a shipbuilding yard there as he was a young man, and it talked about how when he had left for medical school, he showed they had every confidence that he was a young man who would make his mark on the world. Talk about irony.
Wow. Thank you. My goodness. 3 people want to hear the answer to Shelley's good question about, do you plan on researching and writing about another true crime case or serial killer? And I think she's suggesting Connecticut's very own Amy Archer Gilligan from Windsor, Connecticut, just down the road from here, who's the inspiration, of course, for Arsenic and Old Lace, and used strychnine and arsenic as her poisons of choice.
Well, I'm in the virtual room with someone who seems to have the poison market cornered. And I don't think a guy from Nova Scotia should be taking a Connecticut story. My last book was about a swindler who pioneered the Ponzi scheme in Chicago. This book is about a serial killer I'm now looking at sort of a different a kind of criminal, and I'm pursuing a case of a gentleman thief, not unlike some of the people watching have probably been riveted, like I have been, to the Lupin series, the French show based on or derived from the turn of the century stories of Arsène Lupin, the monocle, top-hatted, kind of looks like Cream in some ways,
Yeah.
gentleman thief who is bad but good in some ways too. So I've discovered a character in New York who seems to who has a great backstory and a great story. So that's probably what I'll pursue next.
Thank you. And so, Deborah, I think that Dean is handing Amy over to you to write about.
Well, I live in Massachusetts, so I'm at least
Close enough.
and can do the investigation. I actually have thought about doing a book that focuses on female poisoners. There's a number of really remarkable ones. I don't think they get enough credit. And I think it would be really fun, which will make me sound creepy, I know, to take a look at a really good female poisoner and build a whole story about both that person and what it says about the use of poison by women. Not that there aren't plenty of great male poisoners, as Dean perfectly illustrates, right? And you could go back and find others of that period, Pritchard, the human crocodile, right? Or Eric Larson does a male poisoner in his book Thunderstruck, right? I mean, there are certainly record male poisoners, but I don't think women have gotten the credit they deserve as poisoners.
And can I just clarify for our audience, and just to make clear, this is not something to strive for, right?
No, this is not something to strive for, but it is a really interesting untold part of this of the story. So, that's certainly been something I've been thinking about recently.
It's telling, Deborah, the kind of company we keep, at least in a research point of view, that you think of it as female poisoners just don't get the credit they deserve. In a good way. In a good way.
Sometimes I hear myself and I go, man, you sound creepy. But we completely understand, and we're completely on board with you. And so the KC has kind of a related question. So Amy Archer Gilligan obviously is a historic figure now, but would you ever consider, I think this is for you primarily, Dean, would you ever consider writing about a modern day serial killer, like a contemporary nowadays?
I have in the sense that I started my career a while ago as a reporter covering the courts, and that's what got me into historic true crime. My background was history. I was covering the courts, covering trials. Started hearing about precedents that sound interesting from the past that morphed into examining and resurrecting, retelling old cases. So now that I'm in the past, there's a certain challenge to that. I think true crime is such a great window, in this case on Victorian society. When I did my Swindler Leo courts and Empire of Deception, it was such a window into the excess and gullibility of investors in the Roaring '20s, which explained the stock market crash and a bunch of other things. Mm-hmm. So I'm quite taken with that. I wouldn't rule out a contemporary case, but one thing you do avoid when you go into the past is that feeling of, are you exploiting? The grief that can still be raw even decades later. And that is a calculation I think a writer of more recent true crime would want to deal with, and people who do that or are well positioned to do that tend to be the journalists covering it or writers who are getting involved in the story and as it unfolds.
If I can just follow up on that, I mean, that issue of exploitation is such an interesting one. And so when I wrote Poisoner's Handbook, which is really set in 1920s and 30s New York, afterwards, I heard from the grandchildren of murderers and the grandchildren of murder victims. And I gave a talk at the New York City Medical Examiner's office, and I was talking about the fact that these are 100-year-old killings, and people were still living them, and they were still affecting people's lives. And it made a huge, and they said, yes, they had people coming into the medical examiner's office for decades, still trying to find justice and still trying to fix an unresolved injury. And it just reminded me, I mean, when you're writing about something like the killings of Neil Cream, you're not stepping all over people's lives the way you can. But even these old killings, because murder casts such a long shadow, you have to remember that you're writing in the power of the real,
Yeah.
and that these are real people. And it does make it harder when you're writing about more recent events, I think, in some ways.
And one of the things I did is I tried to investigate, were there any descendants? There were no direct descendants of Thomas Neil Cream, but he did have a large family, and doing some genealogical work could really not turn up anyone. Because this is somebody I'd want to, you don't want to spring this on somebody.
Right.
You'd want to say to them, I'm going to tell this story. What do you know about it? And what do you think about it? Because obviously the families of victims are affected. There was a stigmatization of Cream's family. These and it's a good insight, Deborah, that this lasts lifetimes.
Yeah. Fascinating. There are many more audience questions, but I'm going to take host privilege and ask just a little bit of a distinction. As we've been talking about this, and we're talking about true crime. My grandfather used to read these true crime magazines, and they were cheesy things and kind of maybe a little racy or illicit. Can you just give us a distinction between the kind of historic research-based work that you both do versus that genre of entertainment?
Do you want me to go first?
Yeah.
Well, hopefully a little more highbrow, I guess.
Mm-hmm.
I know what you mean, like True Detective, Master Detective, and in fact, some of the crimes I investigate, that's where they might resurface, often lurid, often made up. Well, my default position is you don't make anything up, you don't embellish, you don't add to, you creatively tell the story true to the facts. You don't make up dialogue, you find dialogue in terms of transcripts or interviews that are verbatim in the newspaper. Sometimes you can reconstruct a bit of dialogue to move the story along. So I think that's a big distinction, and I know the kinds of magazine pulps, I guess they would have been known as, and but some of them actually are quite valuable. It just depends on who the author was, and I've been amazed at stumbling over some very renowned writers who started their careers writing for those, writing some true crime accounts for those magazines that were later used in anthologies and things. So like anything, you've got to be discriminating, I think, when you look at it.
Yeah.
I love them too. I mean, again, we're writing about real people in real life, so you don't have to embellish. I mean, a crime has its own power in reality, I think, and I think that's really important. I'm friends with a lot from Poisoner's Handbook. I still have a lot of friends who write contemporary true crime. I actually used to be part of a blog called Women in Crime Inc., in which we told true crime stories. And I think, sometimes Dean's absolutely right. Sometimes those lurid early tellings, they tell you a lot about the period in question, as well as the crimes, and some really fascinating writers. I'm thinking Damon Runyon, right, writing about poisonings in the 1920s. He called one the dumbbell murders because they were so stupid. The killers were so stupid. You just get these fabulous pictures, right, of the people at hand.
Well, and if I can just throw in, believe it or not, in the 1940s, the coroner who caught Crean in a place called Belvedere, Illinois, and this was when Crean was finally convicted at one point, went to prison before he was released. The coroner wrote an account of his encounter with Crean. He must have been in his 90s by this point, because we're talking from 1881. This appeared in something called Master or True Detective, one of those magazines, which hopefully I was able to find on eBay.
Oh, wow.
And because there aren't a lot of libraries that keep these things. But this was wonderful. And I mean, I'm thinking, well, no matter what the reputation of the publication might be, I mean, this was firsthand an account of someone who was in the room with Cream. I mean, you don't find that too often. So I'll take it wherever it is.
Oh, that's fascinating. Thank you. I think we have about 10 more minutes or so. So you're game for a few more questions?
Absolutely.
And audience, I got to tell you, we always hear from our speakers, whether we're doing these talks live in our auditorium or online, that our audiences ask the best questions. And I just have to say, tonight's a really good example of that, and really wowed by your questions. So here's another one from Anna. Why would someone purchase strychnine in the first place? What purpose did it serve in Victorian times, and why would one need special permission to purchase it? Just wondering why this would raise no concern among pharmacists selling it.
Well, it did and should have. Cream as a doctor could obtain it when he at times in his career when he was a legitimate doctor, because he was, for instance, when he went to Chicago, he was licensed by the Illinois Medical Board to practice medicine. By the time he gets to England, he's a convicted felon who served 10 years in prison and is not practicing medicine anymore. He went to a pharmacy and asked for strychnine and said he was a doctor attached to St. Thomas's Hospital. Well, he had done training 15 years before at St. Thomas's, but he had no current affiliation. And there was a really uncomfortable moment for the druggist clerk, who had to take the stand and explain why he had sold strychnine to Cream, because he wasn't entitled to it, and it was regulated.
Oh, wow.
But the question about was there legitimate use? Strychnine, an overdose of strychnine or a fatal dose of strychnine, basically makes the nervous system go haywire. That's the convulsions, the arching of the back, like a tetanus attack, just horrific body seizures and contortions. In minute amounts, that's a muscle stimulant, but only in very minute amounts. So there were legitimate uses for it in medicine. And I don't know. I could ask if there was a poison expert in the room. I could ask if it's still used today. Is it, Deborah? Is that what you put in our coffee tonight? Is what I'm trying to find out.
Oh no!
I know. You shouldn't have touched that cup.
Fatal mistake.
Doctors don't prescribe strychnine as a tonic anymore. When we were talking earlier, I mentioned that I've seen some variations on it in sort of herbal remedy departments even today. I saw Nux vomica pills at a store that I will not disclose. But a lot of the poisons that we have a difficult time access today were more readily accessible at that time. I was showing, and I'll just hold it up again, this bottle that I keep, which is a tonic, an over-the-counter tonic from the Palisade Manufacturing Company of Yonkers, New York, from the early 20th century. It has both strychnine and arsenic in it, right? Arsenic was in cosmetics. Strychnine was a popularly prescribed tonic. They used cyanide, was fairly readily accessible at that point. We can't get our hands on any of this stuff now. So it was easier, not just for Neil Cream, but for poisoners in general to operate at that time.
the check on it really was the distinctive symptoms, which again could mimic tetanus, but most doctors were pretty wise to what it is. And in fact, Dr. Watson, not a real doctor, but when he and Holmes encounter a murder victim, by the contortions of the face, Dr. Watson is able to almost instantly recognize it as strychnine poisoning. So it was well known at the time.
Doesn't it strike you that there's this arrogance to Neil Cream then, that he'll use this poison that shouts its presence out? It's kind of amazing.
But also making sure he's a long ways away. I mean, he's killing from afar. How's that for godlike? Take these pills before bed. He's long gone.
Yeah.
All the victim knows is that somebody named Fred, not his real name, who was a doctor, had given these pills that were supposed to be beneficial. So yeah.
Gosh. And just as background, how common was tetanus at the time? And so were there a lot of cases where doctors had to look and say, this is either tetanus or strychnine?
Well, that's a good question. I only know it from the lens of it mimicking strychnine. I didn't really. It was common enough that the two could be mistaken for each other, and I don't have the knowledge to know, but I'm wondering if maybe the way we treat tetanus now may not have existed, so it might have been more common at the time.
I mean, we have the shot now that you take for tetanus about every 10 years. It used to be much more common. They used to call it lockjaw, remember?
Yeah, right, yeah.
And I can remember seeing it in women's magazines of the early 20th century with warnings, warnings, warnings. So yeah, I could see that.
And most medical men could tell the difference pretty quickly. The trick was proving it, and that's where the toxicology was still being developed to say, okay, but how much strychnine, and is it there, and can you detect it, and how much? Was it a lethal dose?
Yeah, it's fascinating.
Wow. Wilfred would like to know, you credit Cream with 10 murders. Does your gut tell you, though, that he's responsible for more? And what makes you credit one but not another?
We've got to get, a great question, but I think this crediting, we got to stop crediting killers.
Right.
Accusing. But no, it's a great question. And I wanted to I didn't want to add a murder to the list that I didn't think there was strong evidence for. And at this distance, it's hard to be definitive. But when you look at the sheer number of times he was accused, he was either the most unluckiest man in the world, being falsely accused, which I don't believe, or he was the luckiest in the world because he kept getting away with it, which I would adopt. But it's a good question because there were some other intriguing deaths around him. One was the mother of his sister-in-law, who died suddenly. But this was after he'd been convicted and had come home to Quebec City. So the doctor was attuned to the fact that had Cream done something, and that didn't seem to go anywhere. There were at least two other women who came forward or were discovered who were sickened by pills Cream had given them. Was this luck that they didn't ingest a lethal dose? Was he even more cruelly playing with people and only giving partial doses and just sort of proving his ability to convince people to take pills? And there was at least one fellow who had the misfortune of having the next cabin to his on a liner coming back from London at one point. And Cream offered him some pills, but he prudently declined them. And Deborah had mentioned another case of a woman in Lambeth who was given the pills, but she didn't know they were poisoned. But she didn't like the feel of this, and she pretended to take them and then threw them away. So there's at least 4 or 5 other cases that may have been attempted murders.
Wow. I'm seeing, I don't know, I keep envisioning a Netflix miniseries about Cream. I think this audience would probably be on board for that. Nancy Dunn says she missed the start, so maybe this came up already. I don't think it did. What evidence do we have that serial murder is a phenomenon that appeared with industrialization? I wonder if people just didn't recognize it before then.
Well, that's a really good question. I mean, is it? I did try to see what the ethos, what the era, what the culture and society and morality did say about breeding somebody like this. And I think there's a point that you're rightly hitting, that this is a time of dislocation, of rapid industrialization, and just the mobility of people. I mean, we think in the past people stayed close to home. I mean, no. I mean, you could be on a steamer and across the Atlantic in 5 days. Seems like an eternity to us, but at the time, this was very mobile. I mean, all Cream had to do to skip town when he was accused of something was jump on a train. The border was quite porous. He seemed to be able to go back and forth to the States. At one point, when he was accused of a murder in Illinois, he simply crossed over the border under an assumed name. He was caught. So it was an era of transportation, fast trains, steamships making Atlantic crossings faster, the telegraph speeding up the spread of information and news. And as I said, this dislocation, urbanization may have been a factor. Suddenly, a serial killer like Cream, like I said, didn't have to stalk too many victims. He could go to a city like Chicago that was full of potential victims.
Oh, thank you. So I think we're going to take 2 more questions, and then everything else, folks, you're just going to have to buy the book and learn about it there. Okay, fair enough. Where's Cream buried?
Well, that's a really good question. Because he was buried in 2 places. At the time he was executed, okay, spoiler alert, I guess I don't want you to think he got away with this. He was executed in 1892, and in those days, the bodies were interned in the under stones of the passageway that future men and women going to be executed would walk, marked with a single letter, C, I guess, in his case. So that's where he should have stayed. But then this was Newgate Prison, which was beside the original Old Bailey, if anyone knows London, the main courthouse, Central Criminal Court. But a few years later, Newgate and the old courthouse were torn down to build the present Old Bailey. So all of those bodies, what remained, were collected up and taken out to a suburban cemetery in Ilford on the fringes northeast of London. And that means that Cream is actually buried in the same cemetery as 2 or 3 of the Ripper victims, and also whoever was executed at Newgate before him.
Wow, Shelley, thanks for asking that.
And it's an unmarked grave, so somewhere out there he lies.
Wow. And one more question. I think this is a great one to wrap things up with. And I also would invite Deborah to hop in and with any final thoughts. But Steve wants to know, why do you think Dr. Cream has been largely forgotten? Before you wrote about him, his victims at least should not be forgotten. And it does seem interesting that I'd never heard of him, and it seems like many of us had never. Why do you think that is?
Well, I think you can compare him to the Ripper. Everyone's heard of Jack the Ripper. No one's heard of Thomas Neal Cream. Thomas Neal Cream looks like, I think I'm right to say, killed twice as many people as Jack the Ripper. But there's no closure with Jack the Ripper. It's almost a parlor game. Who was it? And we're still, the question is still asked and unanswered. Cream does have a resolution. There's a monster that we know did not resurface, and that's important about the Ripper. I mean, there were on both sides of the Atlantic for years afterwards. If there was a particularly brutal murder, especially of a woman, the press would say is Jack the Ripper returned, New York, wherever it was. So that might be part of it. Um, I really can't explain it other than to say I'm glad he was forgotten, because it's just this. I really enjoy digging into forgotten stories, stories that shouldn't be forgotten. But you mentioned as well about the victims, and that's one thing I really wanted to do. I wanted to make them characters in this, because in serial killer accounts they tend to be uh, uh, overlooked or secondary to the monster who killed them. I wanted to make sure they at least had the dignity. I mean, from earlier accounts, even the names weren't spelled right, or the cities they were in weren't right. So I wanted, as part of my research, to meticulously, as much as I could, make them real people, so people understood the tragedy. They weren't just numbers. They weren't just yet another sex worker or unfortunate woman. That they had families, they had lives, and they did not deserve to encounter Thomas Neal Green.
They mattered. And if you write about history, it's always such a realization that people who were really famous at the time, and Neil Cream was international headlines at the time, we lose them. And so people like Dean, or I'll say modestly sometimes me, who go back into history and find these people and bring them back to life. It's a wonderful privilege to do that. You're able to bring back these moments in history, or bring back people, or bring back forgotten victims, and remind people that this is part of our story. How did we get here? These people were all part of our story. I don't think it's wrong to forget a lot of serial killers. I wrote a Kindle single about a notorious American serial killer, Albert Fish, who was prominent in New York in the 1930s and is famous as a child cannibal. And when I wrote that Kindle single, it's called Angel Killer, I did a whole history of stranger killers. I was never so glad not to be reading about serial killers as when I finished doing that story, because they also remind you of the darkest side of who we are. Right. And so I think we want to pick the ones like Neil Cream, as Dean has done really brilliantly here, who can remind us of what we're capable of. But I don't think we want to spend all of our time bringing back the worst of our dead, if that makes sense.
No, and again, my goal was, yes, I have to recreate this monster. Yes, I have to recreate his crimes and find out what I can about his victims. But the central question for me that I thought made it more than just another account of a serial killer is, how did he get away with it?
Yes.
And what that said about the times, his status, policing and forensics, I think is fascinating. And that's really, so I came in it with a question I wanted answered. Hopefully I'll have answered it for readers as well.
I think we all just can't wait to read. If you were not inclined to purchase this book before, I can't imagine that you aren't now. So here it is. The link is in the chat. I'll try to repost it. Before we go, I wanted to ask, has either of you been to the Mark Twain House?
I have not, but because you are on my list now. And I think I told you, Jennifer, I'm coming to tomorrow night's book event too, because I'm so excited about what you do.
That's this one.
Yes, love that title. So count on me to show up, dragging my family with me.
I am counting on it. I'm going to hold you to it. I know where to find you. How about you, Dean?
And we were talking in the green room that I'm a big fan of Twain's, and I was aware certainly of the house and the museum, and I have wanted to visit, so now I have even more of an excuse to visit.
Yes, you do.
Yeah, he's just such a fascinating character. And again, anytime I was mentioning, anytime I'm researching in the 19th century, I want to see what Twain might have said about wealth or society or politics. He's a good person to he's a good person to quote.
And
everyone knows him.
he said a lot about a lot of things too, so that makes it pretty easy. So one of the things that I like to share is that, you know, the Mark Twain House is a writer's home, and I like to think of it as a home for writers. And having done this evening, you're both now in our circle of writers, so I'm counting on you to stay in touch, and please do come see us and get the grand tour. And please, like I said, stay in touch. We'd love to have you back again sometime, and I know our audience agrees with me there. Well, thank you so much.
Well,
It's been a
thank
pleasure.
you.
And
Yes,
congratulations again, Dean. It's just a wonderful
Yes,
book.
congratulations.
Thank you, Deborah. Thanks to everyone for coming, and then thanks to the Twain House for having us.
Absolutely our pleasure. Thank you. And thank you to our great audience, and thanks for the great questions. So maybe we'll see some of you tomorrow night and see you again soon. Bye, everybody. Good night.
Night.